Committee has worked with council members to hear their concerns and to make some modifications to the bill. I would say that there have probably been quite a number of changes. The essence of the legislation in terms of the public's concern over crime remains intact. So, for example, the bill and the amendment nature of a substitute will have a section dealing with the restoring the law that used to prohibit masks in the district. That would be the wearing of a mask during the commission of a crime. It restores the drug-free zones. There have been some changes to that in the amendment nature of a substitute, but the essence is still there. It refines the language regarding vehicle chases and chokeholds. And let me be clear, at no time has it been the council's intent that vehicle chases by the police can never occur. There's always a risk to the public when there's a vehicular chase, and that has to be balanced with the gravity of the situation. For instance, a carjacking where there is an infant in the back seat. We've heard those reports. Of course, it would make sense that the police could pursue. It's never been the council's intent that there could not be car chases. And in fact, there's been a general order from the chief dating back decades trying to limit vehicular chases. So the council is responsive to the police department's concerns that the language, most recent language, meaning adopted by the council a couple of years ago, was still a bit restrictive, unnecessarily restrictive, and the legislation addresses that. Same too with regard to chokeholds. The provision regarding firearm endangerment remains in the bill. The refining of carjacking, and I'll explain what that means. So that's still in the bill. What we found over the last couple of years is that there have been instances where a vehicle owner or a vehicle driver is approached and they're outside the car. The key to the car is stolen from them by force or threat. And the U.S. attorney has said it's difficult to prosecute those as a carjacking because it's not clear in the law that, because they didn't actually pull the person out of the car. I think that this is either the courts or the U.S. attorney being a little bit too cautious. Nonetheless, we're clarifying. So, you know, if the vehicle is proximate and the keys are being stolen by force or threat, that's not just a robbery, that's a carjacking. Retail theft remains in the bill, of course. There are going to be some refinements to that. What we're looking at is actually for repeat thieves who may be stealing at a misdemeanor level, that after a certain number of arrests or convictions, they could be prosecuted as felons, or it would be a felony prosecution. Pretrial release remains in the bill. There's some refinements there. So I suspect there'll be some questions, be happy to answer them, but I want to emphasize that the bill's moving forward. The council is doing its part. This is a very lengthy and comprehensive bill, and so of course there are going to be some amendments, and Councilmember Pinto has been working with council members to incorporate amendments in the amendment nature of a substitute. So that's just been circulated. There are a number of emergency items on the agenda. Give me a second here. I don't think any of them are controversial. The medical cannabis clarification is actually a re-upping of emergency legislation previously adopted. The medical cannabis license clarification is partially continuing some provisions, but also reflecting that there's some deadlines that necessitate some clarification in the law. Deadlines at the Alcoholic Beverage and Cannabis Administration. The historic preservation of derelict district properties is continuing emergency from a year ago. That deals with 4 historic houses in the historic Anacostia district. It's actually a great story. The L'Enfant Trust acquired the properties from the district. There was a bit of a fight over this 5 years ago, but the L'Enfant Trust got the properties free. The properties were in horrible, horrible condition. Like one of them, the half rear of the house had been removed because it was about to collapse. The trust has restored 3 of the houses to historic district standards, and the 4th is underway. Street vending amnesty is allowing or making it clear that the Office of, I want to say Office of Tax Administration can share data with the Department of Licensing and Consumer Protection so that the amnesty program for street vendors can proceed. Road barrier standardization, I recommend to you that you read the notice of that Councilmember Nadeau circulated. I find this a little hard to believe, but the city purchased some barriers that the Adams Morgan bid used for closing streets during street festivals. The bid no longer needs them, wants to give them to the city, and the city is saying, well, we don't have standards for using them. So this legislation, I mean, so the city would rather use police officers to just sit in cars all day and block a road as opposed to putting up barriers and bring up police. This legislation takes care of that. And then Councilmember Bonds has a couple of emergencies dealing with election workers. There are a couple of other items from the mayor, but they're rulemakings and I'm not sure very exciting. I'll be happy to answer questions about them. I do want to also bring up that the mayor and I are in the process with the Attorney General of sending a letter to the Senate asking that it move promptly on the confirmation of, I believe it's 7 nominations to the Superior Court. I believe there are 12 vacancies right now, and this is seriously impeding the court's ability to process cases, including criminal cases. And these vacancies need to be filled. They've actually been languishing for quite a while. The nominations were just reported out of the Senate committee, and the purpose of this letter, which I'm hopeful will be sent today from the mayor, myself, and the Attorney General, is to ask the leadership of the Senate to get these scheduled for a vote. I'm also concerned about the announcement to mark up legislation in the House Oversight Committee that would be antithetical to police accountability. It's legislation that would repeal a section from the police accountability bill that Congress tried to overturn a year ago, but was not successful. I want to emphasize this is about police accountability. The provision in particular, it's a section, I think it's section M for what that's worth, and has 3 or 4 different components to it. One of which is so what the legislation that's being considered for markup would do is restore a 90-day statute of limitations for police discipline, which is to say that if a police officer does something that should be disciplined, if the department doesn't bring the action within 90 days, then the officer can't be disciplined. So my staff brought to me a couple of examples where this has worked against good policing. One was a police officer who was, I believe he pled guilty to burglary and not in the district. And the chief moved to terminate him, and the arbitrator, through the FOP bargained disciplinary process, the arbitrator said, happened after 90 days, and therefore the officer has to be reinstated. Therefore, a convicted burglar has to be reinstated to the police force. Another example was a police officer who was accused, I believe, found guilty of assisting in a car theft, not in the district, I believe in Maryland. Again, the 90-day rule precluded the chief from terminating the officer. This makes no sense why we would have car thieves or we would have burglars on our police force. Not only is that antithetical to public trust in our police department, But if you think about it, when police officers are involved in any sort of law enforcement, they may be witnesses, no credibility, none, zero. I mean, these officers cannot perform the duties and functions required of a police officer. And yet the disciplinary system requires that the disciplinary system has led to their being reinstated on the police force. There are other examples I could give you that don't involve this 90-day statute of limitations, but do involve the bargaining process. And so the bill that the House is considering, excuse me, that the committee is considering, would also repeal a provision that has been law for the past 3 years. It reserves as a management right to disciplinary process for police officers. And to give you an example there, and I have this document in front of me, an officer named Jay Hong, this was a number of years ago, he raped a college student who was visiting the DC area on a study abroad program. This involved a driving under the influence accident. The arbitrator's decision, even if she had testified, it's unlikely that the MPD would have been able to establish the charge of sexual assault because of her highly intoxicated state at the time of the alleged assault and the associated memory lapse. In other words, she was too drunk, in the arbitrator's opinion, to be a good witness, even though there was evidence of sexual assault and driving under the influence by the police officer, not in the District of Columbia. And so the arbitrator ordered that the officer be reinstated instead of, to be reinstated with a 35-day suspension. That's the kind of cop we want on the police force, but this is what the disciplinary process leads to, and what the House is in the process, or the House committee is in the process of going back to. It also would, the House action would limit the discretion of the chief to impose disciplinary penalties greater than those recommended by a trial board. So the trial board looks at some egregious conduct, says the officer should be suspended for 20 days. The chief thinks that's not good enough. 30 days, can't do it if the House gets its way. Very, very bad for police accountability. So I am very concerned about that. I sent a letter to Congressman Norton in November in the hopes that the bill would not move, and I'd be happy to share that letter if you want. Let me just see if there's anything else I want to cover. Be happy to take questions. Yes, Meg.
Elaborate on some of the amendments that we're going to see in this legislation. Obviously, I've not had a chance to go through the ANS yet, but specifically on police accountability and transparency, there were a number of concerns that lawmakers raised, and I'm wondering how and if those were addressed.
Without taxing my memory, I would say most of those concerns have been addressed.
Okay.
Is there one in particular?
Well, I think that's the question I have, is like which of them, or like what specifically has been changed?
Yeah, what specifically? You're going to tax my memory. So there was a provision in the committee print that would have narrowed the ability to FOIA information. That has been removed from the committee print.
Okay.
There were some provisions that narrowed the Office of Police Complaints access to police records when there's a complaint about a police officer. That has been removed. There are a few others, but at the moment I'm kind of blanking. And I, of course,
To clarify, at least on those couple of changes, the FOIA changes you're referring to are the
Yes.
changes that would have removed the ability to FOIA disciplinary records in unsustained cases.
Correct. And that's
Okay,
been,
so that will remain the FOIA law.
assuming it gets through the council, but I think it will.
Okay, does the council intend to fund those provisions?
I intend to see that they're funded. Now, you know, last week I asked the mayor if she was going to fund the bill. There are a number of provisions that have a cost. And if
Okay.
you were present last week, so you heard her answer.
Okay, and on
It's
the
not a full-throated yes.
OPC changes, the Office of Police Complaints, this is the language that specified that they have unfettered access if it's related to an active investigation.
Yeah.
So is that language, like that if or that
That's out.
qualifier being removed?
That's out,
Okay.
yes. MPD is concerned that the Office of Police Complaints will seek more than it should, which in my experience of 20 years looking at the Office of Police Complaints, they have not done. OPC's concern, Office of Police Complaints concern, is that MPD uses whatever qualifying language it can to withhold information, which makes no sense to me. The Office of Police Complaints has a long track record of being discreet with the information it has. It is public about when it sustains discipline, but otherwise it's been very discreet and but it's found it difficult for years. The MPD is just not cooperative. And I want to state that very clearly. MPD has not been cooperative. And so the law should not give to MPD any excuse for discretion when Office of Police Complaints needs information to investigate a complaint regarding a police officer. And the value of the Office of Police Complaints is, just to take it to its basic, is that if you look back over the past decades at police departments around the country, police departments are not good at investigating themselves. They just aren't. And yet accountability is critical with regard to law enforcement, because these individuals have ability that no one else has, which is the ability to deprive somebody of liberty and even life. And so accountability is paramount. And so we have an independent police complaints board. And that police complaints board has been, has always been somewhat handicapped by MPD's reluctance to share information. So that's what this is about. And the current law, which says unfettered access, will be continued.
Okay, there was some debate around changes to the vehicular pursuits language
Yes.
that was further refined from the emergency legislation. Were there any amendments on
Yes.
that point?
So there was, my recollection is that the committee print with regard to vehicular chases, it remains intact in the amendment nature of a substitute, except for a provision which would have struck essentially a definition of what is deadly force and serious use of force. Those were not prohibitions. And let me just say by analogy, you know, when a police officer fires their firearm, that's use of deadly force. They're not prohibited from doing that, but as you know, it's heavily regulated. Well, same too with car chases. For instance, if a police officer chasing somebody rams the car intentionally, well, that would be a use of deadly force. That doesn't mean it's prohibited. The committee print would have struck those definitions, and the amendment nature of a substitute keeps them. Dorothy?
I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, if you don't mind, about the emergency bills that are on tomorrow's agenda dealing with elections.
Yes.
There are a total of 4 emergency bills and 2 temporary bills dealing with emergencies pertaining to our elections in 2024. And personally, I'm always very concerned and suspicious when something as important as this comes up just a few months before an election. I'd first like to ask you about Mrs. Bonds' proposal for the Election Worker Protection Emergency. It's both a declaration, an amendment act, and a temporary bill. Do you know very much about the bill?
I only know what she put in her notice. Have you seen her notice?
Yes.
Okay.
Um,
I don't know more than what's in the notice.
the stated purpose of the Election Worker Protection Emergency Amendment Act is to deal with offenses against election officials and election workers. And then it goes on to detail what those offenses are. And they include abduction, arson, aggravated assault, assault with a dangerous weapon, assault with intent to kill, assault with intent to commit any other offense, which it doesn't define, threats of violence, stalking, burglary, carjacking, armed carjacking, extortion, or blackmail. I was taken by the fact that it never mentions what most people are concerned about and aware of as regards the need to protect election workers. And namely, that has to do with intimidation and harassment. And indeed, as you know, there is a bill currently before the Senate that makes it a crime to, quote, intimidate, threaten, coerce, or harass an election worker. Can you explain, or can you make inquiry after this press conference as regards why the definition of protection is so unusual in terms of it includes things like arson and abduction and things like that, but it doesn't deal with what most people are concerned about coming out of 2020, that is intimidation and harassment.
I can certainly talk to Councilmember Bonds about it.
The other question I have to ask you, it has to do with the second series of emergency election bills. And that
Eliminates precincts.
eliminates precincts. And a bit of background, I was surprised to see it because as you know, the monthly meetings of the DC Board of Elections have a court reporter. And for the past 6 months, at least for the past 6 months, every Board of Elections meeting, there has been a discussion of redrawing the precinct boundaries. And indeed, Monica Evans, the board's executive director, went into great length about how she went and hired Gottlieb Simon, who used to head the
Yes, I know who he
district's
is.
ANC office. And as recently as 2 weeks ago at their meeting, she indicated that they had finalized the report. It
Your
was being
question,
sent to Octo and that it was being sent to Ms. Bonds. And now, in essence, Ms. Bonds is moving to do away with precincts. Why? There was never indication that this was on the books or a
I only
plan.
know what's in the notice.
Excuse me?
I only know what's in the notice.
Would you support doing away with precincts?
I don't support that.
Are you going to talk to Ms. Bonds about it?
I will talk to her about it. Any other questions?
Do you know where it came from, this idea of
I do
dealing
not
with
know.
away
I
with
only know
precincts?
what's in the notice. Alex?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about drug-free zones. I
Yes.
see in the ANS, they seem to have changed a little bit, both around not interfering substance abuse treatment and in
Yes.
limiting how much time they can actually be declared. Can you talk me through, like, what were those changes about? Why did you make them?
Well, I didn't make them. The Councilmember Pinto made them, but she talked with members with regard to their concerns, and that would be why they were made. I know that at the Committee of the Whole meeting 2 weeks ago where the bill came through, that Councilmember Henderson brought up a concern that the drug-free zones could impede the effectiveness or the participation, if you will, in clinics. That makes sense. So that would tell me that's why that was adjusted. I can't speak to the timing. I know that there've been a lot of concerns. In fact, when the mayor introduced the legislation, and that's where this comes from, I had put out a statement and I said that in the past I'd supported the drug-free zones, but there have always been constitutional questions around them. And that's the balancing that Councilmember Pinto has tried to strike with the bill. So I suspect that that has something to do with the any changes to the time.
I was going to ask about your concerns about its constitutionality. I know the AG has signed off, but I take it if you're moving forward with this, you don't feel that there's a chance that this could get challenged in court?
Oh, no, there's a chance, but I think the way the bill's written and the Attorney General's advice is sufficient that in terms of constitutional grounds, the council can be relatively comfortable. I mean, come on, Alex, we pass legislation that gets taken to court all the time. I'm thinking about our gun control legislation. And we try to craft it with an eye on whether it could withstand a judicial challenge. And that's what Councilmember Pinto has tried to do here.
And lastly, I wanted to ask about Joel Caston's nomination.
Yes.
you wanted to take more time with it. You met with the Sentencing Commission. I guess those conversations were productive. You feel comfortable that.
Well,
this is
you
gonna
could
get
have
a
been
vote?
there. I don't think you were.
I was watching.
Okay, well, I thought it was a very productive session with the Sentencing Commission. The Sentencing Commission doesn't decide sentences. In fact, what the Sentencing Commission does is it reacts, I emphasize, it reacts to two factors. One is what the sentences are prescribed in the statute. So we say, for example, that the sentence for, I think, robbery is 15 years and up to 15 years. So they take that into consideration, and then they look at what judges are actually sentencing. And they strike the middle range, excluding the bottom 25%, that is the lowest, and the top, the highest 25%. And the guidelines are in the middle. The purpose of the guidelines is, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding here, is to try to achieve consistency. Try to achieve in the sense that the guidelines say to the judges, with sentencing within these guidelines is consistent with what all the other judges are doing and consistent with what judges have done in the past. So the Sentencing Commission does that analysis, but the Sentencing Commission doesn't sit around and say, we think that for a robbery, the sentence should be X number of years. That's just not what they do. As the Mr. Fry, who briefed the council, explained, they're really a data-driven agency. They're actually quite useful. I recommend you look at their annual report with regard to plea bargains and how many cases actually are brought to trial. So that's, I think that was a long answer to your question.
I mean, you're going to move forward with Joelle's
Yeah.
nomination.
Yeah, the Sentencing Commission did some research of sentencing commissions in other jurisdictions and found that increasingly commissions are putting someone who has been in the, experienced the system on the commission. My understanding is that the commission, when it debates, has healthy debates. When it decides, I think with one exception, it's been by consensus. So just having somebody who's actually experienced the system, they think will be helpful, and other sentencing commissions have said that it's helpful. And I have every reason to believe that Mr. Castone, who's a citizen of the district and has been active civically for the last several years, will be a constructive member. Yes. And we'll make our way
Last
to-
week at the council mayoral breakfast, you said you wish no ill will on anyone regarding the potential move of the Caps and Wizards to Virginia, but if the deal falls through, we're ready to pick it up.
Yes,
It was your,
that's still my view.
does it have to be that passive? Is the city constrained by law or by etiquette from sort of direct involvement in sort of the Stop the Arena movement? Can you help them in any way, or would that be? And
Gosh, I don't know how to respond to that. I do think there's a balance that we on the council and the executive, the mayor have to strike. We don't want the Monumental Sports to move its two teams from downtown. And yet at the same time, we know that the deal in Virginia is incredibly complicated and costly, and there is a chance that it will not materialize. We've seen that with other large projects in Virginia. I think the formerly named football team was not the Commanders when it happened, was going to go to Potomac Yards. That didn't happen. And there was Disney World, Disney Park, Disney something was going to, I think it was Loudoun County. That didn't happen. So don't want them to leave, but also want to be warm and friendly to their coming back. So that kind of makes it difficult to be angry.
makes it difficult
To be angry. And So, yeah, if there's a way I can help, but I think that if I went down to Richmond and were to lobby in Richmond, that probably would backfire.
I'm talking the sort of logistical support, financial support for the Stop the Arena movement. Is that something the city could offer, or is there something?
I don't even know what that
Stopping that.
means. Because nobody's come to us, but if they did, the council doesn't have a budget before us, so we would not be able to do anything. I don't know what that means. And I think generally the government refrains from funding civic, I don't know, civic expenditures of that sort, even where there might be sympathy. Yes, then I'll come back to you.
Thanks. I have two questions about Security C and then two questions about other things. Are there any changes to pretrial detention statutes in the, or the pretrial detention provisions of the bill in this ANS?
I believe there's a minor one that I discussed with Councilmember Pinto, which is to reduce the burden on the court with findings of fact as well as a statement of explanation when the court decides to release somebody over the objection of the U.S. attorney. But I think there might be some other changes.
Okay. And a lot of the pushback to drug
But
free.
let me be clear. So all I did with her was to suggest that let's not require findings of fact plus a statement, just a statement, an explanation. So there's still that reporting requirement by the court, but it's not as burdensome.
Okay, so the judge still has to write.
Yeah.
Okay. And a lot of the pushback to the drug-free zones in the committee discussion centered on this idea that, well, police can just enforce drug laws with, regularly, like without making a drug-free zone. So what to you is the purpose of having these drug-free zones, the way they're set up in the bill, if that makes sense? What do they allow the police to do that they aren't currently able to do?
Well, let me answer it this way. First of all, both MPD and the mayor have said they think this would be useful. So that's reason number one. When I think back to when I chaired the Judiciary Committee and there were drug-free zones in the law, it was not just drug-free, but it was also prostitution-free zones. There were two different statutes, but very similar. And that was before there were questions raised about their constitutionality. As I recall, there were never any actual arrests. However, they were useful in disrupting those markets.
Okay. And then I have a question about Councilmember McDuffie's restaurant relief bill.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that Councilmember Lewis George introduced an amendment that basically defines service charge fees as tips, not base wages or tips. Do you support that amendment?
I just became aware of it and she's not discussed it with me, so I don't have a position as I'm standing here.
Okay, got it. And last question. I know last week a number of ANCs sent you a letter about your appointment about Jack Evans.
Yes, and I
And
responded and
you
everybody
responded.
got a copy of my response, even though I didn't send it to everybody.
Okay, I guess just wanted to ask if there's anything you'd like to add or clarify about the appointment or the backlash.
I'll just add this. I'm not going to repeat everything that I had put in writing, but I will add this. I spoke to Mr. Evans over the weekend. He attended a meeting of the commission a week ago. He attended their retreat. Somehow I think I have my weeks confused. It might have been 2 weeks ago and the retreat was a week ago. He said that they've been very welcoming and everybody's getting along at the retreat. They had a kumbaya moment. The way he was describing it, it was quite wonderful.
Thank you.
Again,
About pretrial detention, but I think that covers it. Well, I just want to clarify one point on that. There's a statement of facts that they're still required to issue, but they're not required to explain their reasoning. Can
other
you
way
please-
around. There has to be an explanation, but not a finding of fact. It's
Well,
just,
don't
I
you
thought,
need a finding of fact to give the explanation?
no, findings of fact in in that kind of an order or decision would be a listing of all the facts, and then separate from that would be a judgment or conclusion or explanation.
Okay.
My feeling was that the court has been resistant to this, and actually other jurisdictions, they tend to do just the opposite. Instead of a statement where somebody is released, it's a statement when somebody is held, which makes sense because when you're holding somebody, you're pre-trial, you're depriving them of their liberty and they haven't been convicted of anything. And that's not to say that it's, I've had too many negatives. I absolutely believe that it is in the public interest to hold people pre-trial many times. And what our law says is where there's a risk of flight or a danger to the community. The court's been resistant. When I read it, I felt like, do we need to require findings of fact and a written explanation? A lot of cases get processed in C10, sort of one right after the other. How much do we want to burden the court? How much do we really need? This is, my understanding is that this is something the U.S. Attorney wants. And so I think that getting an explanation is, well, I know that getting an explanation is more than we've been getting. And let's see how that plays out, but we don't need to pile on.
Okay. And you said there were some other changes. I mean, I think this
I
is a
think
pretty
there are.
significant statute. So if there,
Yes.
like even minor changes can have a big impact. Can you
As I'm
elaborate?
standing here, I could not tell you without looking at the ANS. And the ANS, if it was done right, I haven't seen it, should have a underline and strikeout, so you could see quickly
Okay.
what the changes are.
You also mentioned some refinements to the retail theft provisions. What
Yes.
are those refinements?
Well, there were several provisions there. First of all, there's the establishment of a new crime, which is organized retail theft. As far as I know, that's untouched in the ANS, the amendment nature of a substitute. But then there was reducing of the threshold for felony from $1,000 to $500. So what's been in the law for roughly 15 years has been that theft of value under 1,000 is misdemeanor, over 1,000 is a felony. This will change it to 500 being the demarcation. Third, there was some language about multiple thefts over a 30-day period, and that's gotten rewritten. I haven't seen the language, but the concept is that if a person is committing multiple thefts, misdemeanor thefts, within a short period of time, or has been convicted over a number of years multiple times, at some point, that person should be treated as a felon. In other words, be prosecuted for felony, even though the individual instances were misdemeanor. And then there was another provision in there that said that it would also be a violation of the theft statute if there was intentional destruction of property or an assault. Well, those are already offenses under separate sections of the criminal code, and it doesn't need to be in the theft statute as well. And I believe that's been taken out of the committee print.
One question on the multiple thefts over a 30-day period. I mean, is there,
I'm not sure that's the final language in the ANS.
okay,
but it
I'm
is
just
a-
curious if the council has considered, like, if for people who are misdemeanor theft, accused of misdemeanor theft, is there like a financial like accumulation that is being targeted here? Or
I
if people
believe-
are stealing,
Well, I haven't
just like
seen
a
the
few
revised-
items, like maybe 10 items a month, but there's still misdemeanor theft offenses. I mean, is this like a 3 strikes type of thing? Like they're going to prison now? Or like what is the sort of paradigm of like what the,
It's analogous to the 3 strikes. Now, I haven't seen the language, but it's analogous to the 3 strikes. So if you commit, if an individual commits misdemeanor theft and commits it again, and commits it again, a serial thief, that person could be prosecuted instead of for misdemeanor theft for felony theft.
okay. I guess my question is, what is the threshold?
I
as
don't
far
think
as,
there's a
like,
monetary threshold.
There's
there.
not, okay.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what the items are, it's
Correct.
the number of offenses.
Correct.
Okay.
I'm getting a signal of 500. For the repeat, has to be over 500? An aggregate over 500.
In aggregate.
Yeah, I
over
don't think that's what
500.
I discussed with the council member, but that's apparently what's in the ANS.
Okay. And what's the hope with this provision that it, I mean, what do you think?
Well, what
is
the hope
desired?
is that, the hope is twofold, maybe threefold. For the retail, the organized retail theft, that's an emerging trend across the country, that our statute is responsive to that. That's one hope. The second hope is that the other changes will make theft less likely, or give tools to law enforcement to prosecute. And the third is that there is a problem with some serial thieves. I remember this years ago, an individual was breaking into cars. I think had been arrested 20, 30, 40 times over the years. I mean, at some point, in my view, it's not a misdemeanor, it's a felony. And so I would call that a tightening of the theft statute.
Okay.
There were more questions. Yes. You're back, you're on sports. Everybody else is on crime.
Well, I'm on crime now.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
Look, last week, former President Trump, while campaigning in Nevada, pledged to take over our horribly run Capitol. He's on the presidential campaign trail, promising a federal takeover of DC. Now, you sort of had a taste of this last year with the criminal code rewrite,
Mhm.
with this becoming sort of a national talking point. Do you have a response? And what can you do in the face of, if this is going to be a national presidential campaign talking point? What position does that put you in, and what can you do?
I
And the
think
mayor just called it
we've all
disgusting.
figured out by now that there's a lot of bluster that comes from the former president. That doesn't mean that that it's of no concern. I don't really want to dignify his comments with a response. Nonetheless, we are able to pass our budgets on time. We are able to, year after year, run a balanced, how do I say, run a balanced budget? To stay within our budget, to balance every year. Our finances are among the strongest in the country, and that's not just me chest thumping. There is no jurisdiction that is fully funded in both their pension and their OPEB. We have a AAA rating from Moody's. We used to have 60 days, now we have 51 days of reserves, which is pretty close to best practice. We have an independent chief financial officer, which irritates the council when we have the budget, and irritates the mayor when she tries to spend the budget. But it means that both of us are constrained in potential mischief. We lead the country in LEED certified buildings. We have one of the best climate change reduction laws in the country. I can't think of all the different ways that we are running a very, very good government. It's a good talking point to say that we're a mess. I think the Republicans, because this is partisan, also like to say that all the Democratic cities are a mess. So you kind of left that out of the quote, but that's probably because that's a different quote that he made. And then I look at what's really happening in some ways. So I touched on the budget. Congress has yet to pass the budget for the fiscal year that began 4 months ago. They continue to have a rider on legislation that prohibits us from being able to regulate legalized cannabis, which is why we have so many illegal cannabis shops, which in turn attract crime. The Congress has been unable to confirm our judicial appointments, so we have vacancies on the bench, which makes it difficult, among other things, for the criminal courts to function. While I'm at it, the police department requested reimbursement of $48 million for expenses related to the federal government. And Congress, year after year, underfunds that reimbursement. That certainly doesn't help public safety. And then they turn around and criticize us for reducing the police department by $9 million 4 years ago. They're reducing it by 10 million, 20 million this year. And year after year. Let me think of some other examples, or do you want me to come up with more examples? So they actually are hurting public safety in these ways. With the illegal cannabis shops, underfunding the police, not approving our judges, that hurts public safety. And I feel like there are a few more on that list, but so that's the better run that the former president talks about? I don't think so. Mr. Rice.
On the police discipline bill that's going through the House, if it to go into effect, it would have to be approved by the Senate and signed by the president?
Right, we have to, the disapproval, it's not a disapproval, it's a freestanding bill that repeals these accountability provisions. It would have to be approved by the House and approved by the Senate and signed by the president.
Do you have any thoughts about the Senate going along with this and whether the president would sign it?
Well, the last I heard, it's not clear that the House would pass it, but we don't, these days, I don't take anything for granted. So we're going to work the bill.
Sorry?
We're going to work the bill and make it clear that
You mean,
we don't want rapists, car thieves, burglars on the police force.
in other words?
That's my message. We do not want burglars, car thieves, rapists on the police force. And that's what these provisions would allow. Megan, did you have another question? Any other questions?
There was at least some consternation about the neck restraints provision.
Yeah.
Is that remaining as is, or was there any?
I
adjustment?
think there's a change. In my conversations with Councilmember Pinto, we're both in agreement. We don't want, how do I put this? We don't, there should not be chokeholds and neck restraints. We don't want to see incidents like George Floyd being murdered. We don't even want to see incidents where there's a minute of that or half a minute of that. The police have said that there needed to be some refinements to the law because incidental touching could be construed as a violation of the law, which is not our intent. So there's been a lot of look at the language, and I don't know if the language has changed between the committee markup and the ANS. My conversations with Councilmember Pinto is that we're going to continue to look at the language so we get it right. Does that answer your question?
Not particular. I mean, I'm
Well,
wondering
so-
if there was like.
So
a
if
specific change.
if somebody is resisting arrest and there's a struggle,
Yeah.
and that happens from time to time.
Well, I understand. No, I understand what the council has described as the intent of the
Yes.
changes. I'm
do
wondering
we
if
have the
there
right
has been
language?
a specific change since the committee print.
Yeah, I don't know. I discussed it with Councilmember Pinto over the weekend, and we'd gotten some suggestions from some folks who work with this issue nationally. But I don't know whether whether that led to
Do you
some
know
changes in the
which group
language.
that was?
I think I'll leave that out for the moment.
Okay.
But
I'll
responsible
get
people,
back to you on that.
responsible people.
Okay.
I have another
Oh,
on
I'm
my
sorry.
list.
I mean, you're saying that groups provided input on the bill, but declining to tell us which groups. I mean, I think this is a really important piece of
Yeah,
legislation.
well, I
with-
actually didn't phrase that way. We've gotten some suggestions on the language, some folks who have worked on this issue nationally. That's not quite the same as we got comments from groups.
Okay.
So,
Can you say who is providing this input? I mean, if it influenced changing the legislation, I think people might want to know.
let me be clear. We're not looking at changing the legislation. We're looking at making sure that the language with regard to chokeholds is right. Now, I get it that you could say, well, that's subjective, but we We don't want to impede an officer's ability to arrest somebody when there's probable cause. But at the same time, we want to clear in the statute that the kind of behavior that has happened in police departments elsewhere is against the law. So what's the correct language for that? And there was some concern about the language in the committee print, but I don't know that we've figured out if there's a way to refine it to better clarify it.
Okay, so that's still in the works.
Yes, and I'm happy to explain it to you more, sort of more as like, I'll say background, just so that you understand better.
No, I understand the different arguments around it. I think what I'm interested in is how that will be resolved or what that will look like. So,
Well, there's either something in the ANS and I just don't know, or there will continue to be
Okay.
some conversations.
okay, thank you.
Yes.
Do you expect additional changes between first vote and second vote?
Yes, not because I think that there are a lot of problems with the bill, but this is a roughly a 90-page bill. It deals with the criminal law. The criminal law has to be very precise. I mean, unlike other legislation. So as people look at it, they think of hypothetical examples. I'm talking about the criminal code. They think of hypothetical examples. Well, maybe we didn't word this quite right. Let's make some adjustments. So yes, I do think so. Also, the bill has to go through general counsel, which I would like to happen before final reading, so that they can make any technical changes. So yes, I do think there'll be some changes.
Sorry, I keep saying last
But
question.
but I think the essence of the bill will be what gets voted on tomorrow.
Okay, the Office of Racial Equity issued a report on the bill. Do you have a response to that? Some of the concerns they raised about, the bill having such a disparate racial impact?
Well, I think I'll just respond this way. Unfortunately, there is a very high correlation between crime and minority communities, which then, of course, raises the racial equity issue. I'm not sure that we have much choice in how to address that. We find, for example, that overwhelmingly that violent offenses are committed by African Americans, and overwhelmingly victims are African American. And I do think that there are long-term strategies that are long-term, so they don't really help us with crime in the moment, that would promote equity, and that we need to continue to push those.
Like what kind of long-term strategies?
Well, for instance, public education. And, there's been discussion in the council. We took the earned income tax credit, turned that into a variation of a guaranteed income that helps with equity and poverty. We created a couple years ago a program, Baby Bonds, which helps kids in poverty. I'm saying this because these programs deal with poverty, and poverty correlates with crime. I'm not saying it's causal, but it correlates. And so programs that are focused on long-term strategies to change poverty would be a long-term strategy. And I think as well, education, which in a way combats poverty, that's also a long-term strategy. But if you ask me what we can do to reduce carjackings this year, I would not say the answer is to improve public education over the next 10 years.
Are you confident that this bill will reduce crime?
I'm confident that it is a step, and that the council is doing its part. But as you know, thank you for the question, I have said over and over again that the primary strategy for reducing crime immediately is increasing the case closure rate. That a primary strategy in reducing crime is a higher prosecution rate. If people commit crime and they don't get arrested, there's no deterrent effect. There's no accountability. So just happen to have the statistics in front of me. In 2022, 46.2% of homicides resulted in an arrest. In 2022, 20% of robberies resulted in an arrest. So 80% of the time, there was no arrest. Let's take motor vehicle theft, 2.3% case closure rate. So that means 97.7% of the time, person who's committed motor vehicle theft got away with it. We've got to increase those case closure rates because we can talk about sentencing until the cows come home, till there's 3 full moons in a month. If you don't arrest, there's no sentencing.
Is there anything the council can do to increase the case closure rate?
Well, I have asked over and over again of MPD, what resources do you need to increase your case closure rate? And they have to identify what resources they need. And then we'll do what we can to fund them. I introduced a bill. It's not part of the bill tomorrow, and that's because I introduced it in December. But among other things, it authorizes that civilians, trained civilians, can conduct certain investigations for MPD instead of using sworn officers. This bill that Councilmember Nadeau has with regard to barriers. Why are police tied up in a car all day, acting as a barricade on the street when we can have a barricade on the street? This is when there's street festivals. We need to look at ways of either getting police, more police on the street. I'll give you another example. The police, MPD just set up an office of recruitment and retention, which is a good thing. And they staffed it with sworn officers. They could staff it with civilians. So we need to be more creative in looking at ways to get police out on the street, and then ways that we can have alternatives to police, like my bill that would authorize civilians trained, I have to emphasize that, to investigate cold cases, to investigate property crimes, or to take reports, such as like automobile accidents or theft. That's a way of freeing up police. Another example, which is not in my bill, is that, for downtown, we could increase a sense of security by giving money to the business improvement districts to hire civilians like the SAMs and the ambassadors who wear uniforms and are just present on the street. That would give a sense of safety. They don't have police duties, but there's more of a presence. There are ways that we can help the police. And if we free up officers, I don't know what their caseload is because I don't chair the committee, but is the caseload too high for the detectives? I do have these statistics. Let me see. Why am I not seeing here? No, it was the homicide closure rate. Decreased from 82% to 52% between 2012 and last year.
What were the numbers?
Homicide case closure rate decreased from 82% to 52%.
Over what period?
Whatever 2012 to 2023 is. Now, that's different than the number I gave, which was 46.2%, because I believe that was looking at homicides that occurred homicides that were closed within 12 months. You have to understand the data, and I don't mean to sound patronizing when I say that, but police statistics oftentimes look at everything that happened in a year. This includes homicides. So remember, there were several police officers wounded when President Reagan was shot. One of them died a couple of years ago. The year in which he died, it was ruled a homicide. He was shot in 1981. It was ruled a homicide in whatever year he died, which was within the last decade. That's the homicide count. You have to be mindful of that. And so too with the closure rate. So what the police report in terms of closure rate are all the cases that they closed, even if those cases occurred 2 years ago or 10 years ago. And that's okay. That's just the way the data is reported. We looked at the data in terms of homicides closed within 12 months. And that's less than 52%. That's like 46.2%.
Thank you.
So, but increasing case closure rate, as I said, if you don't arrest, and there's no point in discussing sentences. And then the prosecution rate, and I have that data here as well. So prosecution rate in 2012 was 70%, and in 2023 was 44%, which was actually higher than in 2022, and it was 33%. So if you arrest, but you don't prosecute, there's no point in talking about sentences. One last question
Do you think you'll get a unanimous vote tomorrow?
on the crime bill?
Yes.
That would be nice, but I'm not going to predict it at this point. I don't know. I don't know. Thank you all very much. So the committee of the whole scheduled to start at 11 o'clock or upon conclusion of the council breakfast. Thank you all very much.